Triad Adventist Fellowship. Glad you're all here this morning. I know we have a few visitors here. We're glad to have you as well. Most of you know that we're a lay-led church plant, led by this gentleman right here, Matt Stockdale, our lay leader. And what lay-led means, if you're not up on the church vernacular, that means we don't have a paid professional pastor. And so we've been trading the preaching assignments through the months that we've been here. I've been doing a fair bit. Matt's preached a little bit. We've had some guests. We've also done 2 panel discussions. And today we're fortunate to have our 3rd panel discussion. And some of you, that might scare you a little bit to hear a panel discussion for the worship hour. But we've had a good time with the others, and we look forward to a good time today. And give it a chance. Try something new. One of the questions that I've been asked on Facebook just recently is, I'll just be blunt and say it, this was the question, is your new church a white church or a black church? Well, if you look around, it's both, right? And it's a little brown. We had some brown too. When we set out to start this church, we wanted it to be a church for all people. Amen. And we've tried to communicate that. But I know sometimes we send unintentional messages. Today, for whatever reason, our praise band was pretty white. And Matt and I, despite our best efforts, preach like white dudes. So that's kind of how that is. But it's Black History Month. And I talked to Dr. Phil last week. This has come together just in the last week. And I said, Dr. Phil, I want to do something about Black History Month, but I'm not the right guy to do it. And so he put together a panel. And if they want to come forward and get situated, I'm just going to talk for a second. You know, there's beauty and strength in our diversity. But that doesn't mean it's always easy when we come together and share our culture and our views. And it's only through dialogue and understanding each other better that we can become a more cohesive family. Black History Month is a great opportunity to do just that. In seminary and through my training as a pastor out in Oregon, and since I've been here as a chaplain, my theological perspectives have been greatly informed by many Black theologians and writers. I know you were given a list when you came in of some Black History Month reading. I'd like to add Dr. Howard Thurman to your list. Thurman. Dr. Thurman's writing, he wrote back in the 40s and 50s. His writing has been just spiritually uplifting to me as a pastor and as a Christian, and I highly recommend his work to you. Dr. Carey asked me to spend just a minute or two talking about Black theology and liberation theology. And so, as a white guy, I can only do that from an academic perspective, and then I hope the panel will be able to inform us from their lived experience. But Black theology and liberation theology really started down in South America back in the 40s, but then our African American brothers and sisters picked that up in the 60s and 70s. And there's a wide variance when we say liberation theology, what that means. There's some aspects that are criticized. There's some aspects that Orthodox Christianity embraces. But just at its core, what we're talking about when we're talking about Black theology, liberation theology, we're talking about looking at the scriptures through the eyes of marginalized and oppressed people. And if you think about the scriptures, you think, what is the biggest thing that goes on in the Old Testament with the people there? The Exodus, right? The Exodus. And then you think of Jesus and his ministry, the biggest thing in the New Testament. Who did he minister to? How did he respond to people who were in need? And so there's some rich tradition there, but there's also some great theological things we can gain from understanding the Black perspective, the Black theology. But we're also Adventists, and we have an eschatological, a last day event type theology. And so I'll be interested to hear from the panel how they've lived with that dynamic tension of a liberation theology in the African American churches that talks about the here and now, the social gospel, how we can make our lives better here on earth, but also as we await that final appearing of Jesus, how that will look. So without too much more here, let me just make sure I've covered everything that Dr. Phil has asked me to do here. I'm going to skip a few things here. But I just want to introduce to you Dr. Phil Carey, and he's going to introduce the panel and going here this morning. And I believe, is there going to be an opportunity to have some questions as we go along as well?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's the integral part of the program today.
Well, without further ado, Dr. Phil Carey.
Thank you. I'm sure that Mike is one of the guys there. I'm going to basically, don't go too far, Jack, you're going to need to. I'm going to just briefly introduce each of the panel members. By the way, hello everybody. Hello. They call me Dr. Phil affectionately, but the other guy, I'm older than he is, and I've been around, have my degree longer, so I am a genuine Dr. Phil too. Dr. Phil on TV, actually, his specialty is counseling psychology. My specialty is social psychology, so we have some things in common. To my immediate left is David Elliott. David is really a organizational behaviorist branch of psychology and sociology. Some people in business claim it also, but he also is an IT specialist, and he'll speak to us about some things. Next to David is Phil Jr. Phil is an attorney. He's also an adjunct professor at North Carolina A&T State University, which happens to be, by the way, I was in a meeting yesterday, the chancellor informed us that we are now the largest black school in America. So, Phil, you're doing okay? Associate, he's an adjunct professor over there as well as an attorney. And of course, Carey, all of you met and know her. She is an adjunct professor at UNCG. Also, she's in the area of education, health, and family studies. And our beloved friend, Chaplain Taylor, I'm sure he'll take a moment to put in the word for the series of meetings that he's conducting with us. But he's a ministry and military man. Ministry and military. And all of you can say a little bit more about yourselves as we go along, but we're just happy to have all of you, and welcome to the panel. I will set you at ease, just relax a little bit, with a famous statement from a famous writer, philosopher, novelist. His name is James Baldwin. And just about everything we talk about today with respect to celebrating African American history and culture during this month, go online or check with the Smithsonian, or you may want to take a little trip, take your family out to Jamestown, Virginia, and get the facts. As Adventists, truth matters, doesn't it? Amen. The facts count. And so we are going to speak from a factual point of view this morning, and we want you to really respond to that and affirm that and embrace it. James Baldwin said something that encapsulates and pretty much sets the stage for our discussion today. Many years ago, he said that the African American is a unique creation. Never in the history of human civilization has a group suffered so much, so long, and yet, within a short period of time, with little or no help, accomplished so much. And that's the story in a nutshell. That's the story in a nutshell. We'll have different perspectives reflecting on that. And I will get back to you and give you some facts about the population size, distribution, and many other interesting tidbits. But first of all, who's going to go first? Carey, maybe you want to start out with the history and purpose. History and purpose of Black History Month, or Black History Week, or the celebration of the African American.
Hello. I think it's important first to state why we even study history. And history really helps us understand people and society. It's our map, a way of seeing where we've been, what we've gone through, and how we've overcome many challenges, and then also gives us some perspective on things that we might want to take a look at changing or working through in the future. It contributes to our moral understanding and provides us with a sense of identity, which is essential for good citizenship. Black History Month really started as a concept by Dr. Carter Woodson, who was an academic. He was the son of a slave and was fortunate enough to graduate with his PhD from Harvard University. He was only the second African American to do so. And he really wanted people to understand that the history was important to American history, that we needed to be in the textbooks and the history that was passed down to our children and to our children's children and celebrated, and that history needed to be accurate. It needed to be accurately depicted and not forgotten. And he wanted us to know about the contributions of African Americans and their struggle for freedom and equality in order to deepen our understanding, as well as to understand that the good American citizen would acknowledge this history. And so he decided in around 1915 to create a society that was focused on African American culture. And around 1926, this society developed the first Negro History Week. It began as a week, and in 1976, it transformed to what we know now as Black History Month. It's been acknowledged by several presidents, including President Ford, who stated that Black History Month needed to be recognized. The important contribution made to our nation's life and culture by Black citizens needed to be well known and widespread. In 1986, Reagan issued a presidential proclamation that basically said this time was a time to celebrate the many achievements of African Americans in every field, from science to art to politics to religion. And since then, every president has made a proclamation regarding Black History Month and its importance. And each year, there's a theme that goes along with Black History Month. What I think is probably most important, some people may wonder why we've come so far with regard to racial equity, and there have been quite a number of changes from history to now. Why is Black History Month still important? And I would like to challenge that by saying you can learn a lot about a country from what they determine important enough to remember, but I think you can learn a lot more about a country by what they determine is something that they can forget. And so we learn about our country and what we deem as important through the remembrance of Black History Month. Even the Bible points us to the importance of remembering. As we mentioned earlier, the Exodus, the Israelites and the Hebrews, they constantly remembered what their experience was because it helped keep in the forefront of their mind what God had brought them through, where they were and where they are now, and they were thankful to Him for that. And so I'd just like to read two verses. Romans 15:4 says, "For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope." And then Psalm 78:3-4, "Things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us, we will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and His might and the wonders that He has done." And Jesus calls us to remember even His sacrifice through the tradition or act of remembrance. And I find that in communion, we can gain through our remembrance of the suffering of individuals so that we can have a better life. And if we forget that, we really reduce the experience of those individuals and how they really contributed to our lives, whether we're African American or not. They've contributed significantly to our history as Americans. Now, end by saying, if we ignore the facts, we live in darkness, for knowledge itself is light. And I equate darkness with ignorance and light with knowledge. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Amen. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. We need to love our history.
Good. Thank you. Let's give her a hand. We will have an opportunity to ask some questions and get some comments, so thank you again. Our next presenter will be David Elliott. David can talk a little bit about the significance and the importance of the African American history.
Sorry for that. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I feel very privileged to be on a distinguished panel with these scholars. This is what I always tell them. I want to set the stage a little. Luke, if you could play that song for me. Yes, the song seems very anti-God, or says references to no heaven, no religion, and those type of things. But I think that if you take a closer look at what this particular song artist is trying to say, you'll see that he's saying, imagine. He's not saying there is no God, there is no heaven. He's saying, imagine in your mind, if you can. Can you open your mind to a point where you can let go of these labels, what I like to call artificial labels that we put on each other. This whole concept of white, black, they're not real. I mean, we have in the 80s where we started calling black people African Americans because we know there's no place called Blacklandia. I mean, when you ask someone where they're from, they can say Germany, they can say Europe, they can say Scandinavia. You ask an African American where they're from, they don't know. There was a loss of legacy. So these labels aren't real. And I think what the songwriter was trying to say, there's other labels in our society that are also artificial. The things that separate us, the things that cause exclusion. Religion could be one of them. I'm right, you're wrong. I mean, there's 369 Christian denominations, and each one believes that they have exactly the right principles. So that kind of keeps us separate. We're all Christians, but we all have one little thing that keeps us separate. And so now I'm with this group, and you're with that group. So it's exclusionary. So what the songwriter is trying to say, can you imagine a world where these labels are gone? Where the only label that truly matters, humanity, is the principle that we're trying to drive at. Now, what does this have to do with Black history? And I think everything. This month, as Carey stated, could be about all the people in history that have melanin in their skin like me, black people in their skin like me. So I can say, look, there's people that look like me in history that did good things, so I should feel proud about who I am. Or, that's one thing it can be, but it also can be about something that MLK said in one of his famous speeches, and I paraphrase, of course. He said, we should be judged not by our skin, but we should be judged by the content of our characters. So that's the message that I think Black history can be for us. The month should be more about sharing a legacy, a human legacy. Now, some of these people are Black or African American. They did wonderful things. I mean, their actions and their philosophies created the world that we live in now. I mean, I think caused positive change. And if I mirrored some of these philosophies and actions in my own life, I could potentially enhance my own character. And I think that's the importance of looking back and looking at people. They could be black, white, whatever label you want to put on them. But if they were doing things that can enhance my own character right now, I think that's the important part. Amen. So there's a lot of African American people who've done wonderful things. And I think we can look at them as individuals. It doesn't matter if you're black, white, Spanish. You can look at these people that they're talking about this month and look at their actions and their philosophies. What were they trying to show us? And then we together, not exclusively saying I'm black, so it's Black History Month, and I'm white, so I don't care about it, but we're human beings, and we can create a human legacy of people in the past that have done wonderful things. Also, in heaven, who believes that in heaven there'll be a Chinatown? Will there be black neighborhoods in heaven? Will there be Jewish neighborhoods in heaven? No. Well, I don't think so.
Yeah, sure.
But the point is, if we're all human beings and we're trying to create a legacy of love and unity together, and I think that's what this month can be about. That's why this month is important. Thank you.
Hey, for a moment I was nervous with the music. I thought he was going to sing. Good, good. Thank you so much. You did not disappoint us. You were yourself. Phil Jr. is going to talk a little bit about the social, economic, and political context of this whole experience. So why don't you go ahead?
Good morning, church. Good morning. Happy to be here with my other esteemed panelists. This is a little bit different format for me, and I'm hopeful and I believe that you guys will treat me better than my students treat me. So, that's good. I wanted to follow up a little bit on Carey's point, when she was talking about remembrance. And I think that remembrance is critical, both in terms of the historical report, but more importantly, for what it makes us do in the present, what it obligates us to do in the present. And I want to read a few verses from Deuteronomy. This is Deuteronomy 15, verse 11. For the poor shall never cease out of the land, therefore I command thee, saying, Thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to the poor, and to the needy in the land. And I'm going to skip down a couple of verses. And when thou sendest him out free from thee, speaking of servants or slaves of that era, when thou sendest him out free from thee, thou shalt not let him go away empty. Thou shalt furnish him liberally from thy flock, and out of thy floor, and out of thy winepress, wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give to him. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondsman in the land of Egypt. And the Lord thy God redeemed thee, therefore I command thee this thing this day. And when I think about history in a contemporary context, I think about the instruction that the Lord gave to the children of Israel as to their current behavior and how they should treat those who were servants or subservient to them and their culture and society at the time, relative to the place that they were in before. And so in the Bible, there's a direct link between how we view ourselves and what we remember our history to be and our obligation to our fellow man in the present. And I think that's an important aspect of Black History or Black History Month. And to be quite frank, I have taught in other institutions other than AT, and I have a lot of students come to me sometimes and say, well, why isn't there a White History Month, right? We've heard of this before. Why do we have to spend time talking about Black history? And I would say perhaps it's a fault of educators and other people not articulating that it's American history and it's history, but the emphasis at this particular point in time may be on Black authors and Black contributions, but it's part of the tapestry and the history of the entire society. And when we see certain institutions, when we see certain present-day conditions, we need to understand how it is that they came about. So I am interested in history, but I'm more interested in how it is we interpret that history to make us better caretakers of our fellow man, better citizens, better church members. History in and of itself is not enough. And I think that it's an important portal to get us to the place where we understand why it is that we should have compassion for everybody, because we all have come from a place of bondage, both literal and figurative, spiritual bondage. So that would be my perspective at this point.
Okay, I think it'll be good at this point. Let me give you some facts before Marcus comes, and this will be the last presentation. Then we're going to have some question and answer. We have some time left. Hopefully we would do that. There are approximately 40 million African Americans residing in every state of the Union here in America. About 40 million. That constitutes approximately 13% of the population. We are the second largest minority group and the third fastest growing minority group. Of course, you know, the Hispanics and the Asians are the two fastest growing groups now. We used to be number one in those categories, but we've slipped back. African Americans contribute approximately $1 trillion to the U.S. economy annually. To put this in perspective, if we were a nation, we would be the 12th largest economy in the world. The 12th largest economy in the world if we were a nation, independent of America. There are, and a lot of people are not aware of this, there are 4 distinctive cultural groups who are black or African Americans. We have the traditional Southern Negroes who reside in the 18 original slave states. That's one group, and that's the largest group, has always been. In 1865, that group was about 4 million, which constituted about 1/4 of the U.S. population at that time. We also have Northern Negroes, sometimes referred to as the coloreds. They do not have a history like the Southern Negroes. Entirely different history. I won't get into details, but they do not have. They have never experienced what we call chattel slavery. They experienced indenture. And then we have an interesting group, the West Indian Negroes, or African Americans, the Caribbean people. Caribbean people were in the New World 100 years before the first Negro put foot on the North American soil. 100 years in 25 different independent countries called the Caribbean Basin. And then we have a new group, the Africans, who migrate here just like any other migrant group. They come for economic opportunity, for education, and some of them are political refugees. They come from Africa. Again, they know nothing about what we're talking about. They are strange birds with respect to the culture of the African American. Of course, they socialize into that group. So those 4 groups have somewhat distinctive cultural orientations, and it would be wise to know that you need to approach those differently in terms of the interaction. Actually, from the 25 different countries, the Bahamas being one of those where I'm from, it's also interesting that and instructive that you do not mix up a Barbadian with a Bermudan or with a Bahamian. We're all different. To say nothing about the Jamaican or Trinidadian. So these are some interesting things about African American culture and history. And now, distinguished Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Taylor.
Good morning. I'm the preacher up here, so I'm going to try not to preach. First of all, let me say how much I appreciate being invited to be here, and how much I appreciate what is being exemplified here. both in what you're doing in the structure of this church group and in doing a presentation like this. While the military has always been one of the major movers and shakers in our country, unfortunately, the military has not always been on the forefront when we now start talking about this issue of race. While it is true that the African American has literally and factually been involved in every war that the United States has ever participated in, every one, there's not a one. And in significant numbers, even though their service was not always welcomed or recognized, the African American has been a part of every single movement in the history of the military of the United States, in the history of the military of America. It was in July of 1948, just to kind of fast forward, that President Harry S. Truman put into effect an Executive Order 9981, that was designed to bring an end to the segregation that existed in the United States military. And even though that was done, that process was a very slow and arduous moving process. As I thought about what I wanted to bring to bear in this discussion today, a number of things went through my mind, and I thought about all of the things that I could share in terms of historical facts about accomplishments that African Americans have made in the military. But the thing that kept pressing in on my heart, Dr. Phil, was thinking about my own experience. Even though that executive order was put into effect in 1948, my military career started almost 30 years later. When I graduated from high school, and I'm sharing this perspective because a lot of times I think when we have these kind of venues, one of the things that's kind of lost is for you to be able to hear from individuals from a perspective that's personal. Amen. I've lived it, I've done it, I've been there, and that's my story. When I finished high school in 1971, because my father was career Army, quite naturally, as the oldest son, that was what attracted my attention. And I had decided quite early that I wanted a military career like my father. And so when I finished high school, I applied to 3 military academies: the Coast Guard Academy, the Naval Academy, and the Air Force Academy. My first choice was the Air Force Academy because the weird little thing about this little black boy in America was the fact that I wanted to be an astronaut. A black astronaut? Come on, man. But that's what I wanted to do. And so I made applications. My parents got with the recruiters, and for some unknown reason to me, the trend of things seemed to move in the direction of the Navy. So my military career actually started in the Navy. However, as the process went along, right at the back end of the application process for me to enter the Naval Academy, somehow 2 of my records got lost between Nashville, Tennessee, and Washington. And by the time they figured out what had happened, it was too late for me to still matriculate through the process and enter with the class that I would have entered on time. The recruiters that were working with my parents then told us about the ROTC program. However, the ROTC program at the time in Nashville was housed at Vanderbilt University. There was no way in the world my family was going to afford Vanderbilt University. So through the process of time, I was entered into Fisk University, one of the all-black universities there in Nashville, as a student. And it just so happened about the same time that I entered Fisk University, they had started what was called a college consortium in Nashville among 8 of the universities. And one of the things that it allowed was that you could be a student at one school, but through the cross-enrollment program, you could take advantage of programs at the other schools that did not exist at your parents' school. And so through that process, I was able to enter the ROTC program. I was the first black naval cadet in the ROTC program at Vanderbilt University. As a matter of fact, I brought a picture for you to look at. You might want to pass that around. It's a little faded. It's an old picture. But that's me as a naval cadet in the ROTC program at Vanderbilt. Why am I bringing that up? All through my military career, I've had to be a pioneer. I've had a lot of firsts. This was a first. But this was still at a time when the military, and let me preface what I'm going to say now by saying this. I'm not sharing these facts as a disparaging, negative kind of thing. I'm not. Because God has buffered my story and my journey with a lot of good things that have allowed me to move very successfully through my military career. But this was at a time when it was still not quite easy for African Americans in the military. I remember in my sophomore year, I had worked my way to becoming what was known as a squadron commander. And I remember the very first field activity we had that I was going to have the opportunity to play my role and responsibility. And I called my squad to attention and nobody moved. Nobody moved. So I made the attempt to do it again, and it was then that I heard under breath of 3 of the folks in my squadron, we ain't about to do nothing that the word tells us to do. On another occasion, my first summer tour of duty aboard ship, one of the cadets that he and I became the best of friends. He was a young white guy from southern Georgia. His name was Swain. Swain and I became the best of friends. And I remember sitting, it was after duty hours, we were sitting out on the deck. And I noticed there was something on his mind, and he finally got the courage to come out with what was on his mind. And he looked at me and he says, Taylor, I don't want to offend you, but I just want to ask you something. I've always been curious. He says, I've always been told as a child that you people had tails. Would you be offended if you show me your tail? And he was serious. He was serious. I didn't get offended because I learned at that early time frame in my life journey that the thing that fuels sometimes our inability to come together as a group of people has nothing to do with the color of our skin, but it has to do with a deadly trinity that's made up of ignorance, fear, and indifference. Ignorance, fear, and indifference. Ignorance not in a negative sense. Ignorance in the sense that we just don't know. I think one of the things that is significant about venues like this is because it gives us an opportunity to break down that first barrier of ignorance. Because too many times we are separated from one another, not because there's any justified reason for us to be separate, but it's just, we just don't know each other. And so that allows for an environment for all kinds of misconceptions and misinformation that gets generated among us that creates the division, ignorance. But with ignorance comes fear. Psychologically, fear is the response of the human to the unknown. It's our response to things we don't know, we're not certain about. And when there's an environment of ignorance where we don't know each other, it's a breeding field for fear. And rather than trying to get to know each other, the fear, because we don't know each other, creates these barriers and divisions that grow wider and wider and wider. Ignorance, fear, and then indifference. If we allow that circumstance to continue on and we never make an effort on either side of the fence to address that, to attack it, to do something positive about it, that indifference is what allows that kind of environment to stay in place and continue to replicate and breed itself to the point that we become much of what many of us have seen in some of the historical stories and perspectives of the history of this country. But I learned that lesson very early, and so I was not offended. And I took pride in being able to say to my friend, you know, I know those kinds of things have been said about us as a group of people, but guess what? My body's made just like yours. It's just a little darker. And we became the best of friends. To buffer that, one of the other things that was a critical thing for me was, while I was successfully entered now to the ROTC program, the other thing was that to get the Naval Scholarship, which I definitely needed in order to finish my education, the Navy regulation was that in order to get the scholarship, you had to be a student at the parent school where the program was. The commander of the unit at that time was U.S. Marine Corps Colonel. I will never forget the man. White man. His name was Colonel McDonald Douglas Tweed. That man got busy and made it his business that he did not stop until the Navy changed its regulation. And I now became the first black student to get the Navy scholarship through a cross-enrollment process. That's just a few of the things.
Marcus, would you hold that point right there? We're going to get back to more of this experience. The time is of essence. I'd like for the audience to perhaps ask a few questions on the comments, and then as we move along, because I know you have some more you want to share, and anyone up here can ask a question or make a comment also. How are we doing for time, Jack?
Your wife's getting lunch ready, so if you go too far over,
I'm in trouble.
let's go to 12:15, and then if there's additional questions, then will be joining us for lunch.
Yeah, informal, yeah. Okay, any questions out there? This is interesting stuff, isn't it?
I just have a question. I was watching a TV program on UNC Explorer some time ago. Can you guys hear me okay?
Can you repeat the question?
Huh?
Just have them repeat the question in the microphone, so we can't hear it.
Thank you, David. He's our rolling mic man.
Testing. Okay. I'll just restate it again. I was watching TV several months ago on UNC TV, and I had this program about Black history, and it talked about, I guess, the birth or the impetus of the Pentecostal church. And it said that the Pentecostals really got their start in the African American church. Is that true? Do you guys have any knowledge of that?
Marcus or Jack, maybe look on
That is actually a two-tiered process. Because you did have a lot of white charismatic groups that were growing up in America in church history. But the African culture also always made the religious experience or the worship experience of blacks something that was far more charismatic and energetic than traditional white congregations. And with time, those two groups just kind of found their way closer and closer to each other. And so there is a point where those histories merge. But originally that was not the case. But the worship style is what eventually brought them closer to close, and you find the merger at that point.
Yeah, and I could add to that, historically speaking, many of the churches, as the slaves were coming out of slavery, were not allowed into the white churches. They couldn't worship, so they had to start their own churches, and that's why the AME and these other offshoot churches were created for the African slave type people to go to. And Pentecostals was one of them that had a shoe called an African portion when they started a whole church just for the African slaves. But the Baptists were big in that, also the Methodists.
Yeah, there's a question back here. Good, thank you.
I just wanted to thank you guys for coming and speaking about this. One question I always find hard to answer as a young adult who's white is addressing sometimes friends and family and the modern state of racism and equality today, not just talking about history. So I'd love to hear about something we could do as young adults to help, not classify each group as by religion or color or intelligence, and what can we do to just be more of a mankind.
I'd like for Phil and Carey to address those because both of them are professors, and one of those kinds of situations we saw on a daily basis and attended historically white schools to deal with these issues. So, Carey, you want to go first, please?
I think today, as a young person or someone living in today's society, one thing that you can do is be aware of power differentials and how you might, as an individual, put someone else in a specific, put someone else who might not be at the same power structure or power level as you at a disadvantage. For example, I'm a professor and I have students, and oftentimes as a professor there's a certain prestige or a certain power that comes along with that, where people look at me in one way or I might look at them in one way because they're my student. And so living in today's society, we want to make sure that whoever we're talking with or seeing, we don't put on them some form of oppression. So if we're someone from a high socioeconomic status, are we looking down on those people who aren't of the same socioeconomic status as us? If we're religious and someone else isn't, are we looking down on someone else because they have a different religious background than we do? Or are we looking at them with the same eyes as if they were another Seventh-day Adventist? So if they're Catholic, are we looking at them as, oh, they're Catholic, and because we're Seventh-day Adventists, we have the truth, and now we're better than they are. So I think there are ways to incorporate equity in our lives just by the way that we interact and perceive other people. And that should inform our actions towards other individuals. Now, there are certain people in society who do have more power. People generally with more money have more power than those without as much money. And I think there are ways that we can try to change the systems around us so that those systems also give opportunities to the various individuals who might not have that same level of power. I hope that answers your question to some extent.
I would say succinctly, it's a great question. I would refer you to a book and a series of articles called Racism Without Racists. This is by Eduardo Benito Silva, S-L-I-V-A. And just in a succinct way of encapsulating the overall premise, there are systems that are in place. That's why the historical context is important. There are systems that are in place that give advantages to some groups, even when they don't believe they themselves are benefiting from that advantage. And so when Chaplain Taylor talks about the fact that he wanted to be an astronaut, and then now we look in 2015 and we say, well, how many black astronauts are there? And is there a link between his experience going through the chain of command, going to the military, his personal experience, and what we view today in terms of the lack of black astronauts? And I would argue that there is a link, and we should investigate that. So I would say, in a brief answer to your question, be inquisitive, find out the reasons why things are the way they are in a social and historical context. Don't just accept them as being natural or God ordained, right? There's nothing natural about me speaking English and somebody else speaking Chinese and somebody else speaking German. These are languages that we're taught. Children are not born with this inherent prejudice, but through time, through institutions, and through our example, we teach them difference, and they enact these differences in our various institutions, and no institution is immune, even the church.
Amen.
And in most contexts, I don't want to be the controversial one, but the church is the most segregated of our institutions, right? Think about a Saturday or a Sunday, right? Where is there more separation? A church or a bus station? A church or a Walmart? A church or a school? And so we must investigate that critically and not just accept it and say, well, that's just the way it is. And so that's all I would say on that.
My response from a spiritual perspective to you as a Christian, not as a white Christian, but as a Christian man. Acts 17, read it. It says, for God has created all mankind of one blood. It's just a simple matter of understanding we're all human beings. And we all have a common creator. If you can't wrap your head around that, I don't know why you're trying to go to the heaven we're trying to go to. If you cannot wrap your head around the fact we have one creator who created us all. And guess what, y'all? All this stuff we see as differences, both physiologically and culturally, never happened because of anything good. Go back and search your Bible. All of this came about because of sin. Before sin and the fall, we were all common. We even spoke one common language. But God, for our own good, when sin enters the picture, created the diversity. But it was not intended for us to take it and do what we've done with it. It was intended for our salvation. And so my job then is not to continue down the path of difference, but to make my way back to God by learning how to love all mankind as my brothers and sisters, for God has made the humankind of one blood.
Amen. Thank you so much, and we can have some informal discussions during and after lunch. Appreciate it.
Yes, one disadvantage of having panels like this is we seem just to start to scratch the surface of where we're getting to. And so, thank you so much.